Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today's session. My name is George Hockey. I'm the COO of the Confucius Institute here at Coventry University, and I'm joined by one of our teachers, Ms. Wenjuan Liu. Hi, Wenjuan.
Hello everyone.
And as we've seen today, the topic is around parenting in China. This is a very interesting discussion. And we're going to get into that in just a moment. But before we get started, I would like to just say a little bit about the Confucius Institute at Coventry University and who we are and what we do. So the mission of the Confucius Institute is to share Chinese language and culture across our local area, which of course is the West Midlands. We run a Belt and Road Observatory to share updates and information about the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as running language classes and support for schools and for a raft of almost anything surrounding Chinese culture, language, business. And if you are interested in anything related to learning Mandarin, support for business, support for individual groups, whether you're wanting to learn more about Tai Chi, Chinese writing, dance, anything like this, please get in touch with us at Confucius Institute at coventry.ac.uk. Also, feel free to say anything to us in the chat or the Q&A function today, and we will be very happy to get back to you and to clarify anything that we have. So, today's event, the purpose of today's event and the idea is to have a discussion about the general attitudes towards parenting across China. Now, I like to start these cultural discussions with just to say that culture is a huge thing, and discussing a country's culture is near impossible. So while we're discussing culture, we of course are not going to be able to include every aspect of this. China is huge with 1.7 billion people. There are huge differences throughout the cultural groups, whether those are economic. For the sort of the eastern cities tend to be more developed economically than the western areas in China. There are societal differences between different groups. Where the north, south, east, west in China, there are different races and ethnicities across China that will have their own traditions and approaches. So this discussion is based upon some of the most common approaches and is based upon our own experiences, the discussions that we have with friends, with culture. We know what we know from literature, what we see through pop culture, and we are very, very interested in hearing what other people have to say, because everyone's experience is somewhat different, even though there are certain generalities around parenting in China. I'd also like to address the idea that why am I part of this discussion is a question that always comes in. I'm not Chinese, as you can imagine. However, I've been involved in this discussion. It's worth suggesting that my wife is in China. I spent 11 years living in China, during which time we had a child. My daughter went to school in China before we moved back to the UK. We have many friends who went through childbirth, who went and were parents and have had their own experiences across different parts of China. So when I'm coming into this discussion, it's interesting to see what some of my views, what I have seen, what I have experienced from my extended family in law and from my wife's friends and their families and experiences, from the schools that I have worked in and my daughter has been to, as well as through the interactions with the different generations. So the grandparents, specifically around our family, and what their expectations have been. And Wenjuan is here, of course. You are coming from, I think, the other side. So what are your experiences, Wenjuan, of parenting in China?
So actually for me, I have no experience for being a parent because you know, I have never married, and but I can share some points for my back experience about how my parents is teach us how others, like by observing and experiencing for the past years. Yeah.
I think it's very interesting because a lot of the views and the discussion that I think we're going to be ending up having will relate not just to what parents think, but again, what are the generational, what are the common approaches and ideas around looking after children. And we have various topics that I'm hoping to lead discussions in that will apply to well, you will understand as a child, you will have been through and seen these, and will have your friends, your families, your extended groups will certainly have valuable insights. So, as I've said, such a huge topic, has so many views, and we welcome any questions or indeed challenges. If there is, I welcome if someone wishes to disagree, to point out any of my blind spots or things that I would see that have different. I welcome this. That is very much part of where a good discussion can be. So, moving on, I think the first thing to talk about, to mention, when we come to parenting in China, one of the common questions that I have received, that many people have specifically looked towards me when I was preparing to be a parent and child, when I've discussed with many people around the world, is of course the famous one-child policy. So I do remember when my wife first married me, many people around her were interested that as she was marrying someone who wasn't Chinese, maybe she could have more children. And it's worth mentioning that my mother-in-law is still very much of the opinion that we should be having more children. But when we look at a one-child policy, there is no longer the one-child policy across China. There is, however, I believe we can describe as a two-child policy or a two-birth policy. That's right, Wenjuan, isn't it?
So you mean for now is a two-child policy, so that is suitable for everyone?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's not a very fixed policy. So if you have three kids actually in a family, that could be also exist, but most common recommend for each family, they can have two. Yeah.
This is how the law developed, and this is very relevant to how attitudes towards parenting and children have evolved and where they come from, which is why I like to start with this. So of course the one-child policy was brought in to control the population. Now this was with the exponential growth, and this has led to many interesting societal changes in, I think, what we call the top heavy, as it were, age dynamic around China. So there are, for example, most of the older generation will have several siblings. So from my mother-in-law's generation, their generation will generally have several siblings. So the more children was certainly seem to be better. Now then of course this comes down to almost sort of like the inverse pyramid, where now so perhaps Wenjuan's and my wife's generation, where there was only one child allowed, this is sort of the inverse pyramid, where there is an age imbalance that I think is now this two-child policy is having an impact on how, again, traditional expectations. This has an impact on expectations of what people can do. And Yiming has jumped into the chat, say the government is encouraging people to have the second child, but it's difficult because many people are having stress and raising children is very, very expensive.
Yeah, I think that is the phenomenon which people suffering from now. So even we encourage people to have more children, have kids, but it is really sad that the birth rate is fairly low in China now. Even the government, the society encourage people to do that. So which is really sad. That related to many areas why people choosing this choice. Yeah. And for the one child policy for that generation, which is also kind of sad. I am the only child in my home. So lots of my friends, they also the only child. But some of them, they have two, they have three. It is different. But the majority of my parents' generation, they most of them only have one child at home at their family. Yeah.
I mean, getting a little bit away from the parenting, but one of the issues that this has, of course, ended up causing families is that in traditional culture, when children become adults, they will end up taking on responsibility for their older generation. We've seen in the press in the past, China a few years ago passed a law requiring adults to visit their older relatives on an annual basis, at least. And in the past, when the previous generations did have several siblings, this was a little easier, perhaps, to share. I don't like to say share the load, but to share that responsibility for looking after for the parents, whether that's the financial, whether that's looking at time or looking afterwards. However, this is raised and increased the pressure now, so that the single child now is responsible for very much for that, looking after their parent, and especially on women in the traditional culture who are expected to look after their husband's parents as well. So there is a little bit of this, what I think some people are calling the hourglass generation, where this is coming down, and then in the future generations are expected to have two or more children. So that individual child is having a lot of pressure. And pressure is something that we're going to be sort of looking at a little bit later on when it comes to raising children. So, as I say, we start with the one child policy. This has affected how family dynamics, the importance of that child. Whereas in the past, people would have as many children as possible. Children were very, very welcome. I believe in traditional Chinese culture, children are very, very important. That has been amplified by being limited to only one child. And that has, again, very much changed the entire family dynamics. So the next, oops, where am I going? My mouse is getting a bit weird. I do apologize. So the next one, this leads into, I think it's worth looking at these gender expectations. I think last week we had this discussion about gender roles in China and the development. It is worth mentioning that there is an issue in China at the moment that has come about because of a mixture of the one-child policy and traditional expectations, where there is a gender imbalance in China. I believe there are far more men than women across Chinese society, and that has caused some. I think they are causing some issues, of course, because there are a large numbers of men who feel like they have no chance to get married, and it's well, some might expect that would give women more power. It tends to sort of perhaps maybe, from my understanding, have built some resentment. However, this has generally come about because in traditional Chinese society, sons were viewed as much more attractive, much more popular, and unfortunately, for a lot of time, many people would terminate their pregnancies if they were going to have a daughter in favor of trying again to have a son. And this led to actually that doctors are not allowed to reveal the gender to expecting parents, just to ensure that does not happen. I think we were fortunate. I was, of course, very, very happy to have a daughter. I sort of preferred one, to be honest. But it was interesting when we knew that we were going to have a daughter. I did get some not necessarily comments but questions about how I felt about that from friends, from Chinese people, to say, are you okay to have a daughter? Of course. It's these are very much questions that people are asking. So my mother-in-law was like, are you okay? Are we fine having a daughter? I was like, yes. But there are, of course, many stories we hear from friends, from families who where generally the mother is blamed if they have a daughter, never the father, obviously. But I think this is hopefully being alleviated with the two-child policy and the ability to have this one. But there is, again, this does feed into what we were doing before, but this idea of this can give an idea of some of the more traditional or what we say old-fashioned ideas of what's going on. So you mean, yeah, it is, when we say that's very rare, I very much hope it is rare. However, I think in the past, and it would depend, from my understanding, the idea of the people choosing, it's worth mentioning that I think this is a generational thing, and hopefully it's becoming very rare, but I can share one of the most memorable conversations of my life, something I will never, ever forget, is when we knew we were having a daughter. Now, my wife, when we were very far along, I remember we went to pick up some things from her office. She was starting her maternity leave, and I was in the car with my mother-in-law, and my Chinese is not great. And no matter what people think, my Chinese is not very good when it comes to serious conversations about history. So my mother-in-law, her generation, were part of, during the Cultural Revolution, would have to go to, many of them had to go back to the countryside to work, and many of her generation lived through some very interesting times. So I had a broken conversation in my not great Chinese and her non-existent English about about having a daughter, and she had explained and told me this horrifying stories about people that she knew and she was aware of who would and I hate to say it, they would literally get rid of their daughters to try to have sons. They were desperate in very cases. So one of the, again, when I say memorable, if you can imagine, when we have conversations about with language, then we tend to go to miming to help to explain somebody, to have someone try to mime getting rid of a baby or disposing. That was something that does stick with me, and it's something that's massively memorable. So that it's rare, and I hopefully today this is something that is very much changed. But again, in previous generations, people would literally, as they say, they would perhaps drown or kill their children to get a son, which is horrible. I mean, as I say,
Can I say something for that?
Please do.
So I think it is quite interesting topic, but I think generally the expectation is developing and changing. So at the moment, for my generation, so most of, if the people get married, so I think they don't have a very specific expectation whether a boy or girl. So they generally they will believe that it's just kind of gift for them. And lots of my friends, they want to have a girl actually. Yeah, but also related to the policy, so they may have two child, so it's get changed. In the previous time, I've heard some family very past time. So some family is kind of proud if they can have a son. That is may cause the background of the history. But nowadays it's changed a little bit more. Yeah.
Oh yes, absolutely hope so. And this is one, when we come back to the places, I think for far to the again the more economically developed. However, there are the different expectations perhaps in the poorer areas where sons were more attractive, in that they could they were seen to be able to do more work on the farm than a daughter. This is no longer necessarily the case. So hopefully the raising. There's another case that I have, we've had discussions about some people today preferring daughters, is that there was an expectation on young men now to, if they wish to get married, they need to, the husband's family need to buy a house and buy a car.
Yeah.
How is that true there, Wenshan? How does that fit?
I think that is just kind of joking, actually. But for a marriage, and generally for the man's family side, so they more likely to give or afford a car or share the half of the house, but it is also depends on the family specific group. Yeah.
I think this is where, for me, this is where the interesting part of discussion comes from, because of course, we'll see later on, there is a large culture gap between generations.
Yes.
And I think this is where a lot of these differences come in. Of course, the experiences of the previous generations who went through some of the things that we cannot imagine, experiencing, again, through poverty, through experiencing the Cultural Revolution, experiencing some of these things that we read about in history, and to try to have these somewhat difficult discussions. And then whilst we have people today who are far more fortunate, in a much better place to have this balance, I think it's great that we mentioned in our previous session about developing gender roles in China. It's great that people can have these discussions now, and try to understand and see where expectations can be. So it is a difficult subject, but this all sort of brings in towards parenting in China. I think especially we can see this is not, gender imbalance and this is not something that's unique to China. This is something that's worldwide, and it's something that is, especially we can see in recent days in the UK, that there is very much this problems worldwide. But understanding traditionals, where things come from, this is what we are looking today. So my next thing is, we're going to go through the preparations. We're going to go right back to the sort of the very early days, because again, from this is my experience going through, from obviously supporting my wife through her experience and seeing how her friends, we have many discussions and spent a lot of time in the hospitals and around these areas learning. So what we see in what the experience of pregnancy in the West is very different from what I experienced in China. Whereas the expected involvement of the father particularly is far less in China than we see in the West. In the UK, in the US, online, on our pop culture, we expect the husband to be holding the wife's hand, being there in every doctor's appointment, in every part of the journey up through giving birth, through the rest of it. I was not allowed in the hospital room for any of my wife's things, mostly because there was a ward, so there were several women at once, and I would have to wait outside for almost everything. So when there was an ultrasound to see the heartbeat, my wife literally took a video on her phone and sent it to me to say, because I was not allowed in this room.
It is legally not allowed. Can you ask for company with her?
In that hospital, again, this was in a place called Taiyuan in Shanxi, China, just to be very specific, that is not in Haisat. So the hospitals that we were going through, this was a normal hospital, so I was not allowed in because this was not her in a single room. This was they were doing this in a ward where there were various women together. So no men who were not doctors were allowed inside, because there were, as I say, similar with the birth experience in that case. It was on a ward or like a dormitory, so there were various people giving birth at the same time. So no men who were not medical staff were allowed in, full stop. So there are other ways, of course. I have other friends who gave birth. I had a British couple a couple who gave birth, they went to a different hospital that was a private hospital. They with a different health end, and that was because that was a private, they paid more. They were having, they had a very different experience. But for the normal, I think ours would be far more usual experience, because this was the normal, literally called the normal hospital. It was, I love the translations in China. There are normal universities and there's a normal hospital. So for this point of view, that generally speaking, the husband is not so involved. I was literally, like we see in the traditions, sort of pacing up and down outside while my wife was giving birth, waiting to hear one thing or the other, waiting to steer. So I don't know how that's changing. Of course, this was nearly 10 years ago, and not in the main case. So I think this will depend on where you are, which hospitals you go to, and the traditional ideas. But again, generally speaking, I think from looking at my generation, our friends' families, the fathers are not expected to be so involved. Do you think that's fair to say, Wendra?
For now, I don't think so. So now I think they will be more involved, not just on the birthday, but for a long time. I think, just take my friends, for example. Some of them, they already have children, and their husband is really, how to say, very, very responsible for take care of the family, especially for the wife. And I've seen a letter recently written by a husband to his wife, and to show the specific feeling of that day. And he was crying that day. And yeah, it's really touching letter my friend shared online. So I think that is changing. Can I ask you about your feeling during the day?
When my wife was giving birth, I was a mess. It was interesting because everyone's story is their own, and every story is somewhat different. My wife, I remember we met some friends the night before, or the evening before, and we had a big pizza party. And then about 1 o'clock in the morning, my wife sort of woke me up and said, "Yeah, it's happening." So we called up her mum and stepdad, and we drove to the hospital, and then sort of they got bundled into the room, and I was just hanging around waiting outside till about sort of 5 o'clock in the morning, when they got told, I'd been a bit later, would have been close to 7 or 8. I didn't sleep that night, obviously, but yeah, I was in tears when said, but it was a bit frustrating that I couldn't do anything about it. I was going pacing up and down, and then waiting, and then even when we found out, and then I could walk into the office and show my daughter, and then they had to go back and do all the measuring and the cleaning up and get my daughter. It was a case of I just sort of remember some excitement, happiness, relief that things went okay. It was a huge emotion to say, you can say, but it's something that we it's more, and that's from that moment. I think when we look into the expectations there, it then looks into how we experience what I want to say is coming into next. It was the next parts, the sort of next few months, which are weeks and months, that are somewhat important. That we see that there are some differences in the expectations of fathers and mothers. I think we're getting a little bit back to what we were discussing last week, but it was a surprise. Like when there was discussion about getting help, for my wife to have someone to help in the evenings, and then she said, "Oh yes," and you would sleep, and the expectation there went between her and her mum to talking about someone who might help at nighttime, and that person would sleep in with my wife and help in the evening. And I was like, well, where am I sleeping? That was my response. And I think I knew that her uncles and some of the other friends, the husbands, would sleep in a different room to try to make sure they got a good night's sleep so they can go to work. Whereas I was always, just there every night trying to do the help, because I think that was from my expectation of what we should do to try and take that similar load. And I think, again, from the generation around my wife and from her parents, I think we've seen that there is or what appeared to be this misunderstanding amongst husbands about what wives what new mothers did, mostly in the way because they weren't as tired. Because if there is a big difference between one of you is being woken up 3 times a night to feed someone, and also in having a body that's gone through a huge change, and someone else who is getting a good night's sleep and going to work and not spending every second of the day worried whether or not your child, every time your baby is asleep, making sure they're still breathing, it's a very different feeling. Yeah. So, and I think that's something that different family dynamics, different fathers and mothers have the idea. It's worth mentioning as well, I think, did I say in this slide or the next one? I'll come back to that. Oh, in this one also there is the traditional idea that many new mothers are expected to stay at home, stay inside, and not shower for several weeks after childbirth.
Yeah, that is the custom in China, and I think I've heard for beside China or the like Asia communities or religions, so people in the West, they after they have the child, they can even to work very soon. Is that right?
I think it depends on the country. In America, they have to work soon because they have awful maternity leave. They don't have paid maternity leave, and they are almost forced to go back to. I think the difference is the expectation. From my experience, again, the expectation. So I've seen various things. So for us, I mean, we can see that with the good on one extreme example was when Kate had Princess Kate, Prince William's wife, when she gave birth, she was expected to stand outside dressed and with makeup on for pictures hours later. And in the UK, many new mothers will take their children outside for walks, days after they're born. Whereas I know that my friends two British people, they had a newborn baby, and a couple of days later they were sitting outside in the sun with this very, very small child, and other Chinese people walking around were somewhat, they say they were horrified to say, no, you need to be inside.
Yeah.
And I remember I had another friend, a Chinese girl who had her child, and she was really unhappy because her mum was very traditional and saying, you are not allowed to have a shower for 3 months after you have a child. So she would wait till the mother goes out shopping and just sneak herself having a shower so she could get washed. I mean, there are various ways about what's the expected. And I think it comes back to, again, the traditions of what, in the old times, there wasn't so much good healthcare, there wasn't such good cleanliness around the children. Perhaps that has come forward. But again, this is where those traditional ideas that people are brought up with, and we can see around the world these different ideas. I think I've seen in Scandinavia where people would walk around with their baby. When their baby's sleeping, they'll leave the pram outside of the shop and go in and walk around with the babies just outside in the cold. So we have, and we hear the stories of what our parents did when I was little. Kids bounce. No seatbelts in the car. No baby things. Like, it's just. I think we have to look and see what we want to do, what we do is best for us. But it's very interesting to compare. Yeah, there are people who say you're not allowed to have a shower for weeks after you've had given birth, and I think there are many. How would that make you feel when someone say you're not allowed to have a shower for 6 weeks?
I can do that. So I think maybe people believe that during the time the body of the women is kind of weak, so maybe they can easily get sick if they have a shower. But I think for now they may find a better way to deal with that. But many people cut the hairs actually to shorter to be more convenient during the time. And after they had a children, so they will be have a 1 month with called that 坐月子 in China. That it means they have a 1 month to recovering.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that we did mention earlier. You say this recovery. China does have a 90-day minimum maternity leave law. So my wife was working for a state company, and her opportunities for maternity leave were great. She had 3 months off paid. Even during the pregnancy, she was given as much time off as she was needed. The idea that pregnancy, women should be massively supportive, because children again are so important culturally, that a pregnant person is supported as much as they can be through works, through the government. I think that's one positive, again, compared to, as we mentioned, the US. And I've got the friends there who, again, they literally have to take unpaid leave so they can have some maternity leave. And that's I don't think that's a good thing. Let's just say.
My cousin, she had her birth holiday, we call that in Chinese.
Mhm.
Very, very long time. Maybe I forgot the exact time. Maybe a half year, 6 months.
Mhm.
Really, really long. She's getting paid.
Yeah.
And she can, yeah.
Paid maternity leave. I mean, I think that's a very important thing we need to be doing to make sure that, again, we support parents. I know many countries, more and more countries, are also supporting fathers as new fathers, and I think that's also a great ensure that people can spend that time with their kids. So let's move on. It's an interesting topic, but I do want to say, when we're looking at actual parenting, I think one of this picture here, I think, is a fantastic one from a great series of comics comparing the West and the East. And from a general perspective, I think this is quite true.
I think this phenomenon is existing within my generation. Yeah.
Comparing the blue. So yeah, just as a brief explanation. So of course, in the blue, if you have a child, you are one of the family. The parents have their own ideas. I mean, the grandparents have retired and don't want to do anything with it, but they have everyone has their own life. However, we see in China, all the child is the center of attention for everything.
I think if the picture put more adults, I mean, for parents, for mom and dad, for not grandparents, because at the grandparent generation, the journey have 3, 4, or 5.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so not very specific, right?
No, this is the idea. This is a sort of general picture.
Yeah.
Of course, it's not the whole picture, but as the idea of where the child is placed amongst things. The idea here is that the child is the center. Once you have a child, for grandparents, for parents, the child is now the center of attention. I think it's fair to say.
Yes, always.
Very, very much. And looking at this, as you mentioned, the grandparents are great, very something we're going to talk about, because let me see, what do I have next? Family ties towards children. So, as you mentioned, grandparents are not necessarily expected, but they expect to take a very active role in parenthood. So, I think I don't know about your experience, Wenchuan, but I know from a lot of people that the grandparents are, in many cases, in fact, sometimes the prime caregiver to the child. Or they are very much I know my mother-in-law was very much saying, no, why don't you come to live with us? Live with me. I will look after your child. You go to work.
Yeah, I think that is because the culture of family, Western is different. So for China, people very normal. So for many generations, they staying together with a house. So it's very common in China, and at that time, if for parents, they have a child, the grandparents, they get to the age when they is already retired. So they have more spare time to do, and
Yeah.
people always, I think most of people in China always put family on top.
Mm-hmm. Or
So
put the children on top, I think is what we
yeah.
I would say, in fact, when you say the people who are already retired, I know that my mother-in-law was basically saying, when you have a kid, I'm going to retire. So
Oh,
she was
yeah,
literally waiting.
yeah.
But it is worth mentioning again, like one of these things that, because when I was based in Chongqing, one of the things we were involved in that this, some of this is traditional, some of this is put into place through the pressure of modern life. So mothers today are expected to work as much as fathers. So there is the difficulties for childcare. But there is one issue that we see in the poorer communities where the grandparents are spending where many children actually live purely with their grandparents, as their parents do have to go to different cities for work. They end up as called left behind. Now,
That's really
those,
sad.
yeah, that's we feel the same for them. But this is also something that I've seen and experienced with very wealthy parents who are too busy, so they just leave their children with the grandparents to be looked after. Um, um, so this is something that we don't necessarily see this. I mean, comparing my China side of the family to my British side of the family, my mother and father are very happy to help out. I mean, they live 4 hours up the road, so they can't help out very much. But for my nephews and nieces, you know, they can pick up from school, take them to things, but they wouldn't expect or necessarily want to look after them full time. I think their idea is that, well, you know, we've raised our children, you raise your children, we will help you. It's not a case of, you know, I was busy, but now I will raise your children so you can do your work. I think it's a marked difference.
Yeah, I like that way of your parents doing,
Mhm.
because you also leave space, leave time for the parents
Mhm.
to
Yeah,
their child. Yeah, I think that is also good. Also, leave space with the grandparents and parents, because they're all adults. Really complicated if they spend too much time together. Yeah.
yes. I think this. I mean, on a slight tangent, I think this is something that there is an issue. Again, part of the problem in China that I know that the elderly generation is having some difficulties where many of the generation now who have retired have spent their whole life focused on work, because again, whether they've come through the poverty, they're focused on work and not really developed their own interests or hobbies, so that when they retire, when they've retired, their entire focus is on their grandchildren,
Yeah, and that's
which
also really sad, actually.
can cause
Yeah.
a lot of. I mean, I think this is not something to discuss a discussion now, but there is again, I see this difference purely from the personal level, but looking at the generation, my parents' generation. I mean, my mum rides a horse every day. So my dad has his interests of doing this. They are free to do what they like, and they have their hobbies and what they're passionate about, and then will look after children when they need to. But whereas from my mother-in-law and her generation, a lot of them outside of work or when they leave their work, it's hard to find what their hobbies or what they want to do for themselves. Whereas they have the expectation they should spend the time looking after children. And again, that can lead to the conflict between parents and grandparents, because grandparents might have the more traditional view of what, you know, people should do. And as you've mentioned, Wenjuan, and I know Yiming has said, younger people have a different approach to how they might want to raise children. So that can lead to some conflict, especially from mother. The conflict I'm sure in China is the conflict between the mother and her mother-in-law, because very often the married couple would live with the husband's parents, and the husband's mother would be very, very eager that the wife does what she wants her to do, not have her own life. I think many of my wife's friends were quite jealous that her mother-in-law lived on the other side of the world. um, yes, we have quite a few horror stories from her friends about that. But
Mhm.
um, one thing that did jump in that I when I was looking through topics for discussion was something that my wife brought up the other day when she was listening to a discussion between a couple of lawyers in China, is about discipline to children. And this is something that I have seen, and we see when we're in China quite often, is how parents discipline or teach their children. Because this is, when we look at the cultural and the generational differences, previous generations are quite happy to use corporal punishment to smack their children. I mean, this is a big topic in the West as well as the East, whether is corporal punishment okay? However, I think for myself, one of the issues I see is that, and again, please jump in and let me know from a Chinese point of view, what we see with this one child policy, with this, the child being the center and the grandparents being very involved and very active and wanting to spoil the children. Very young children can get away with anything. They are sort of let loose and let free. To one of the things that we see quite often is, if you go to a restaurant in China, you will see the little children up and running around as much as they like, and it's not unusual to see a grandparent following a small child while that she is holding a bowl of food, trying to get them to eat whilst walking around the restaurant, because they don't want to make them sit down and eat like this. For me, that's a very specific example, but I think it's quite indicative of the problems that come later on when, as I mentioned here, once the child is learning that they can do what they like, and the grandma's going to run around and chase them and make sure they eat, at some point as they grow up, they're going to be expected to sit and eat without getting up. They're going to be expected to be told what to do, and that causes some difficulty when the child has learned they can do whatever they like, and then at some point, maybe when they're now going to school, now, right, that's finished, now you have to do exactly what I tell you when I tell you, and that can cause some difficulty. Have you seen this, Wenzhuan?
I think that is not very common, but also the case is existing. So that is a very complex. I'm not blame a certain family if they teach their child or the kids to have a very good manner, but I think for a very Western families, very clever to educate their child to eat well, to be well, have good manner. So the discipline is quite complicated, not only just of the manner, about education, about the value of the horizon of the in mind in the world. So yeah, that is also really hard to be a very good parent actually. Many areas need to care.
Yeah, I'd agree. I bring this up mostly because of the discussions from the past, and because that's one of the, we've had friends ask like how for myself, one of the key things for my daughter was to know if she's sitting at, she doesn't get to stand up and run around, but we'd have friends come across and they would have difficulty getting their similarly aged child to sit still or to sit at the table. They'd just run around and then not eat, and it would be it was one of those things that from my experience has come up, and we see it around in various ways. Of course, this is a difficult topic, but it's something that from my experience, it's something that we see quite often where, again, the young children and people have this difficulty trying to then switch that from being, I know in China you say there are the little emperors.
Yeah.
At some point they have to stop being the little emperor who everyone the life, and then start getting down, which does lead into, and for the last 10 minutes while we finish up, if we do have any questions or anything that you would like us to touch on or comment, please make sure you put that into the chat. This leads into perhaps one of the big issues for parenting in China, which is pressure on children, on parents, on external societal, financial every kind of pressure, similar to the pressures that we face in the West. But I think one area that's very much worth focusing on that causes perhaps some of the biggest issues is education. Is that fair to say, Wenjuan?
Yeah. Recently I saw a health examination of my young cousin. She's currently have her high school studying, and she is going to go to university about 2 years in the future. So she's in grade 2 now. So her examination result shows her pressure is kind of higher than the regular rate. And I think it is kind of individual thing, but it also shows the pressure of the students. I mean, for the teenagers, even they are quite suffer a lot.
Okay, I'm very sorry. I do. Very unfortunate. My daughter's school is calling, so I'm going to have to call to pick this one up just in a moment.
Okay. Okay. So if you want to talk about the pressure, please put your questions or your comments in chat box. So for my generation, when I was in school, I think not too much, but the pressure it doesn't exist. And for the study, and for the largest examination in China is called Gaokao. So everyone, it's kind of like a level GCSE, but it's kind of more common and more complicated in China. So yeah, so that's true.
Yeah, I do apologize about that. I'm afraid.
It's okay.
A call from the school is one of those things you have to answer just to make sure. Oh, thank you. Yes, we've got the pressure is quite common across many Asian cultures. My parents have always pressured me to do well at school too. Yeah, I think the pressures. I think one of the things that, for myself, I had very little pressure growing up. I think I went to boarding school, so my parents weren't necessarily around quite so much. I think one of the things that really showed this to me, one of the things that really made this was so clear, when I got engaged, my wife's family had a sort of engagement meal for us. We were invited to a restaurant, and my wife's cousin at the time was, again, 15. So she was preparing in school under that pressure. And as soon as I came in, it was very interesting that around the table of, that family, so her parents, my wife's mother, and another couple of aunts, all of the aunts and uncles, as well as her mum, immediately made her sit next to me and try to speak English. It's like, your opportunity to speak English. And it was interesting to see how, for me, it was interesting that it's not just the pressure, not simply from the mother, but all of the relatives were pushing her. And I could see that every time after that, whenever she saw me, I could see her shoulders sort of slump a little bit in expectation. Not that she didn't like me. I think she's a teenager. I don't think she had, but she would just knew that, oh God, now they're going to be telling me to do this again. And we could also see, and I say, talking to my wife and her cousin, who are quite close, I think, because again, the age, but seeing that that sort of pressure that the parents felt they had to give to try to get into the university. And for a bit of context, for the university and the HSK, only about 50% of people of high school students in China make it to a university course in China.
Really?
Really, it's a huge. This is why the Gaokao is such pressure. That's why we have so many Chinese students in the UK and in Australia, because many of them don't get onto a degree course in China. They get many in diploma courses, but it is a huge pressure. So this is why, again, this comes into everyone having to pressure their children to go to these extra classes, to go to these math classes, every sort of educational classes in the evenings and the weekends to prepare for this 4-day exam, which causes massive pressure, as you said, Wen-Joanne. Unfortunately, is related to health problems with children, from mental health issues to, I mean, the worst cases, suicides. And that's the difficulty is that from the parents' point of view, they have to put this pressure because they need to give their children the best opportunity to succeed. If they feel, a lot of parents feel that if they see other parents taking their children to these extra classes, they see other parents are pushing their children and other children are doing better academically. If they don't, then they feel like they are not doing their job properly as a parent, if they don't pressure their children. And so we can understand both views, but we see that this also can drive a massive wedge between the children and the parents. Like when your parents are pushing you to study hard.
No, they never actually.
Oh,
I'm super lucky. I'm super lucky. Yeah, my parents never give me pressure in the past, so I can do whatever I want.
Oh,
they offer me lots of freedom. So yeah.
That's great. I mean, I'd love to hear comments again. So if this is pressure, but from what I've seen from this one, this feeling of pressure has driven a wedge between the mother and daughter. Basically, they had a very poor relationship for a while. I think that might be one of the more extreme cases, but I know that there must be people who get very fed up or dislike the way that their parents have to do. I know that it caused issues for my wife and her mum. I think and I can't speak for other people, but it's interesting to look at that the motivations, the societal things that parents feel they must do this.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm quite lucky. So they never asked me to do kind of a certain thing. And, I think the only point they care is whether I am happy or healthy.
Oh, fantastic. You sound...
Yeah, the only point.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think that's a great... I 100% agree with that. I think I'm going to stop the share. That's a great thought to finish on. To say that the parents only do so out of love and wanting child's best, so resentment fades over time. Thank you. I hope that is true. The resentment does fade over time, and I'm sure that as people become parents themselves and gain that understanding, I think if parents are able to have that dialogue and have that communication and understanding, that can heal. And again, every family is different. Every people is definitely different ways that we do each other. So I hope that in most cases, perhaps my view is clouded because without trying to say anything else, the cousin's case is still ongoing and still having some issues. So there are very positive cases and some negative. As we said, with culture, there are going to be many different people. It is now coming to the end, so thank you for joining us and for commenting. It's very interesting to hear some different viewpoints. Thank you, Wen-Joanne, for joining for this one and sharing your experience.
Say a last few words for this topic.
Someone, 很有意思，谢谢. Thank you. We have there in written in Chinese.
Yeah.
A final thought. Do you have a final thought then, Wen-Joanne?
Yeah. So I think it's really hard to be a parent, and also it's really hard to be a children. So we will become to mother or father in the future. So it never ends to learn. And it's more important to think about to the other's perspective and to think about more that is more helpful to growth. Also, not only for others, also for ourselves. Yeah, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, I 100% agree. Yeah, I think the idea it's difficult to say that we cannot say there is a correct way.
Yeah.
Looking at these discussions is not to condemn, not to complain. It is to look as to try to understand with a background of this is where these behaviors come from. This is why people behave in such a way. This is why people believe this is something that is correct to do. And those beliefs are not necessarily bad, because if we understand that they generally come from the best wishes for their children. I think generally speaking, almost that I've seen, or I could say, every culture around the world, parents love their children and want what is best for them. And I think that is the understanding of how that is given is where things can go. And as you've said, the having more discussions, not simply on a societal level, but more importantly on an intergenerational level, in between parents. I think quite often you might see one of the issues is that parents don't discuss enough about their core beliefs about what this is, and perhaps this as well, discussions and ensuring that children understand what's happening, why. It's difficult, but as you say, thinking, discussing, talking about these things, why we do these things, and understanding ourselves and trying to explain is always worthwhile. So.
Yeah, it's really meaningful.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, everyone. And I think we are going to finish there. 谢谢大家。
谢谢，
再见。
再见。
Bye.